Wonderful. Good morning. Is the mic working? Yes, it's on. Good morning. So when George and I were living in St Anne's in our previous home, we were invited one day by a neighbour to go over and celebrate Chinese New Year. This neighbour was called Evangeline, and in the weeks leading up to this, she would see us most days when she was walking by, and she'd say, "Remember you're coming, I'm going to cook this," and she'd tell us about all the dishes. She was really excited about this event, and we became very excited about this event too as we heard all the dishes that were going to be cooked. On the night when we were going to dinner, we left our house, walked up the street, and we could, about halfway up the street, began to smell these dishes. They smelled incredible. And we walked up to her house, knocked on the door, and she welcomed us into her home. The candles were lit, the music was playing, there were Chinese decorations up in her front room. And she honestly was the perfect hostess. There were other neighbours there, she introduced us, she got us drinks, and then she showed us to this table that she had set. There were place cards, we had our names, there was a Chinese calendar for us all, and we sat down, and this steady stream of dishes began to come out of the kitchen. And they just kept coming, dish after dish after dish. And Evangeline was in the kitchen the whole time, preparing these meals, putting the finishing touches and bringing them out. I don't know if you've been in one of those situations. The table was actually quite small, and there were quite a few of us around it. And you know when you start consolidating dishes, sort of put half of the rice into this one, and that happened. And at one point, Evangeline even sort of moved her place setting completely out the way and put more food there. And we were completely stuffed by the end. We sort of rolled back down the hill in a food coma, back home to bed. I wonder, though, if Evangeline, when she got to bed that night, did she have a slight twang of sadness? This event that she had been so excited by had happened, and actually we hadn't really spent any time with her. She'd sort of been in the kitchen the whole time. And this is what we see in our passage today, isn't it? We see Martha serving, getting ready, being distracted by all these preparations for Jesus, that when Jesus actually showed up, she wasn't present with him. Now, you'll know we've been in a series called Jesus and the One, and looking at encounters that Jesus had with individuals in the Gospels. And the reason we've been in this series is because we believe that the God who we worship isn't just some higher being who has some sort of power over our lives, but he is a God who has a name, and that name is Jesus. And we believe that he wants to encounter each and every one of us today by his Spirit. So today, if you haven't guessed it already, we are looking at Jesus and Martha. Now, there are 3 times that Martha is mentioned in the Gospels. The first one we've had read to us by George. It's the most well-known, and I'm sure some of you are sat there right now thinking, Katie, I cannot tell you how many sermons on Mary and Martha, probably know everything you're going to say, and you might be ready to switch off. Now, I probably am not going to bring anything new, that's true, but I do really feel that God, by his Spirit today, does want to sort of give us something from this passage to each of us. He wants to encounter each of us today in it, so do stay open if that is you, please. We also see a second passage in John 11. It's the passage where Martha's brother Lazarus is ill, he dies. Jesus sort of doesn't come in time, and then Jesus does come, Martha encounters him, and Lazarus is raised from the dead. The third passage that we see is then in John 12. That's the final time we see Martha. And in case you think the sermon is going to go on all day with those 3 passages, we're just going to be looking at 2 words in that passage in John 12. That's the story where Mary, Martha's sister, anoints Jesus' feet with perfume. So we're going to use these 3 passages to track with Martha the journey that she goes on with Jesus. Because isn't it true that for us, our Christian life is a journey? I'm really sorry if you thought you would one day arrive, and that day might be today. You won't. It is a journey that we are all going on. So, what do we know about Martha? What can we tell from the story we've just read? Now, Martha had 2 siblings, Mary and Lazarus, and we presume that she is the eldest of the siblings. We presume that because she's the one in the text described as opening her home to Jesus. If Lazarus had been the eldest, we probably would have read that he was the one to open the home. We also know that the siblings, the sisters in particular, are very different. I don't know if you can relate to this, being different to your siblings. Mary, we see, definitely more driven by emotions, more given over to elaborate displays of affection. And then we have Martha, who seems far more pragmatic, more down to earth, more driven by what needs to be done. And finally, we have the last bit of context, that Jesus and Martha and her siblings were good friends. You know, Jesus turns up unannounced to Martha's house. She opens her home to him. That's a sign of friendship. We see Martha appealing to Jesus when her sister isn't helping out in the kitchen. Again, I think you have to be good friends with a rabbi to be able to do that. We see countless ways, but also if you think that's all too much assumption, then we also read in John 11:5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So that's what we know about Martha. She is the eldest of 3 very different siblings, and she's good friends with Jesus. So let's jump in to the text. We see here Jesus arriving with his disciples. Now, they probably turned up unannounced. I don't think they had a way of sort of texting or calling ahead to say, I'm coming. Now, this is Jesus arriving with sort of at least 12 disciples, just showing up unannounced. Now, Martha, I imagine, is the type of person, from what we read, who this probably doesn't flap her. This is probably what she lives for. I imagine she's the type of person, and we all know this kind of person, who will have a freshly baked cake or bread or pot of coffee or whatever the first century equivalent of those would be on the stove, just ready, just in case someone was to turn up. And Jesus and his disciples arrive, and they go through to whatever the equivalent of the living room would be. And we see Lazarus go with them. And then we also see Mary go with them and sit at Jesus' feet. Now, I'm having to restrain myself here because this is a sermon about Jesus and Martha, but I can't go past this moment because this is massive. The fact that Jesus allows Mary, who, by the way, was a woman, allows her to sit at his feet. Not only allows her, but actually encourages it. You know, sitting at a rabbi's feet was taking the place of a disciple. And Mary's in that place. And then we have Martha. Now, I imagine Martha in this moment to be stood sort of 1 foot in the lounge and 1 foot in the kitchen. Sort of having a moment of being, where am I going to go? What am I going to do in this moment? Am I going to go where I probably want to be, catching up with my friend Jesus, sitting at his feet, listening to him? He tells really good stories. Or am I going to go and prepare the meal? And what we see, it says in the Message translation, was that Martha was pulled away. Or in the NIV it says she was distracted by the preparations. And that's the first point I really want to make, that Martha chose distraction over devotion. And isn't this true for those of us who have encountered Jesus before? Don't we come to church sometimes on a Sunday and we hear stories of what God has been doing in someone's lives, and we're like, oh my gosh, Jesus, I want to spend more time with you. And then sort of the week happens and we find ourselves back in the same seat, in the same pew next week, and we think, oh, I didn't do it again. This week, this will be the week. You know, Paul says in Romans, doesn't he? I don't understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. And what I hate, I do. So what is it for you? What is it that pulls you away or distracts you from spending time with Jesus? Perhaps it's entertainment, you know, social media, TV, radio. Perhaps it's shopping. Perhaps it's busying yourself with work. Perhaps it's food. There are many things that we can find to distract ourselves. And whatever it is, let me just tell you, you're not alone. I was reading a book this week called Sacred Rest, and in it said that, unfortunately, the human default mechanism is to do what's easy rather than beneficial. And isn't that true? Distraction comes easily to all of us, just like it did to Martha. But I read this passage, I read that Martha was distracted, and if I'm honest, I feel like it's a little bit unfair to Martha. I want to cut her some slack. You know, it's not like Jesus had told them that he was coming with his friends. You know, it's not like, it's also not like she was distracted, you know, sat in a corner watching YouTube on her phone. I mean, didn't have phones, didn't have YouTube, probably a bad example. But, you know, she wasn't just elsewhere doing something else. She found herself in this situation, and I don't know if there are any elder siblings in the room or people who have an over-sense of responsibility. If you're here, I understand you and I understand Martha. She was there and she was thinking, well, someone's got to prepare the meal if we're going to eat. And Mary's not going to do it, and Lazarus isn't going to do it. So if they're not going to do it, I'm going to have to do it. And they're not going to do it right if they do it anyway, so I'm going to have to do it. So I can't be with Jesus. You know, in that moment, I don't think Martha would have said she chose to be distracted with preparations. I think she would have said that was sort of forced upon her. She had to. And the thing I want you to realise, and the writer of this gospel, Luke, wants us to realise this too, the work that Martha was doing was good. The word used there for preparations is a word called, and I've got to get this right, diakonia. And it's a word that would later be used in the New Testament to refer to someone who served at the Lord's table, who proclaimed the message, and who provided leadership in the church. Everywhere else in the New Testament, this word for preparation is referred to positively. So it's really unlikely that when it's used in this story, it's being referred to negatively. They understood this work was necessary, it was good work. But it wasn't being with Jesus. I can identify with Martha. I could find myself, and I do find myself so often in this situation. Many people can identify with Martha. One of those is John Tyson, who's a preacher in New York City, and he wrote a book called The Burden is Light, and he wrote this: I am Martha, knowing I should be sitting at the feet of the Lord, but behaving like a control freak. I become consumed with attending to the practical details because I live in the real world, where we can pray all we want, but at the end of the day, we still have to get things done. Don't know if any of you relate to that. How many of us find ourselves doing good things for God instead of spending time with him? And what I want to acknowledge in this moment, that there can be just as much distraction in good, righteous things as there can be in more obvious escapism or overt sin. John Piper puts it like this: sin does not keep me from praying, righteousness keeps me from praying. Now, I'm sure he knew sin can keep us from praying, but the point he's making is more often than not, it's righteousness that keeps us from praying. Answering holy emails or just checking out one more piece of relevant news to pray about on whatever news service it is you click on. It's not evil that keeps us from praying, but it's good things. I guess what I'm saying is that distraction, whatever form it comes in, whether it masquerades as righteousness, escapism, or overt sin, is a way of us hiding from God. A distracted life is the reflection of a hiding heart. And this is true of our society today, isn't it? I don't know if you've noticed, but we can't go for a walk without having earphones in and listening to a podcast or some music. You know, we can't go for a drive just down the road without putting the radio on. We can't, some of us, go to the toilet without watching YouTubes. You know, we have to be constantly distracting ourselves. We're experts in distraction because we're terrified. Honestly, people are terrified of what will happen if they just stop. And I think it's the same for our contemplation. You know, we sometimes distract ourselves with so much busyness for God because we're scared of what will come out when we do stop and we do come into his presence and spend time with him. And this is what we see with Martha. There is a moment in this story where she does stop and she does come into the living room, into proximity with Jesus. And when that happens, she is faced with her frustrations. It says in verse 40, she came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to come and help me. We see Martha coming into Jesus' presence and just blurting out all of her frustration. She comes, Jesus notices this in her. She comes with upset and worry. And perhaps that's the reason we distract ourselves and we hide from God, because when we do come, we don't like what surfaces. You know, this is what I experience when I sit down to pray nearly every time. The first chunk of time, if not all the time, I sit down, sort of take a breath, and then I remember something that needs doing. You know, just before this, I've sort of come and I've finally put down that just one more thing that I need to do. And honestly, preparing this sermon this week, I'm amazed at how many just one more things I'm able to find before I come to that place. But when I do put it down, I sit down and I get distracted, and then I get worried about something, and then I think, I don't know what I should be reading or what I should be thinking, and then I get annoyed at not knowing, and then I get frustrated at getting annoyed, and all this emotion comes up. I'm this complex web of emotion, and I find it happens most times that I sit down to pray. And every so often, I'll sort of go and see George. I'll be like, George, I am a mess. I don't think I'm a Christian. I don't know how to pray. Surely I should know how to pray by now. And George, in a loving way, tells me that I'm not special, that there's nothing wrong with me. And there's a writer and a theologian called Richard Rohr. And he talks about, he says that one of the reasons why new monks don't make it often past a couple of weeks is because the first thing, when they still their soul before the Lord, the first thing that comes up is their own humiliation. And many of them don't sort of get to that point of humiliation and give up. They don't go beyond it. And this bit isn't in the text, so I'm asking you for a bit of creative imagination here, but I think there's something in this that God might want to say to us. Martha and Jesus were good friends. You know, when you've got a good friend, you know their sort of charisms, you know what they're like. You probably joke about the fact that, oh, you're the sort of busybody, you're this, you're that. And I imagine it was like that with Jesus and Mary. I imagine they'd had conversations before about how Mary was so busy she couldn't stop and be. And I don't know for you, as I'm speaking or as we've been worshipping, God's maybe highlighted something to you, an area of distraction or an area of sin or even righteousness. And perhaps you're sat there and you're feeling a little disheartened because you're like, God, I thought we dealt with this one. I thought when I went to that conference 5 years ago, you spoke to me about that, I sort of handed it over to you and I was free from it. You know, for me, one of the things, I think there are things for each of us in our lives that we sort of keep revisiting with God. I don't think the spiritual life is this sort of linear process where we start here, God sort of addresses, I don't know, some issue of anger within you. You sort of surrender it, you become free, and then you move on to the next thing. And then at the end, you're going to be this perfect human being just like Jesus. You know, my experience is that the spiritual life is far more like this sort of spiral. And you come back often, you circle back to the same issues again and again, and they'll be different for each of us. I know for me, one of those is control. You know, and one day it might manifest in my wanting to control how long Isaiah sleeps and wanting to get that perfect, and another day it might manifest in a different way. But God each time is inviting me into deeper and deeper freedom as I surrender it to him again and again. So that's just to say, if you are feeling a little disheartened, please don't. Please see it as an encouragement that God is at work in his life, in your life. And what you're feeling probably is a gentle conviction by the Holy Spirit. It shouldn't be condemnation. You shouldn't be feeling guilt. That's not of God. And we see this in Jesus' response to Martha. And honestly, this response gives me so much hope. In verse 41 and 42, it says, "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." Now, we bring a lot of assumptions to a text like this, and to be honest, every time I've read this text before, I have seen this moment with Jesus, this encounter that Martha has with Jesus, as a rebuke. I've imagined her stood there in front of her family, in front of Jesus' disciples, sort of going red in the face, being really embarrassed by what's just happened. But actually, nowhere in this text do we see Jesus rebuke Martha. They're good friends. What he's doing here is he is inviting her into deeper intimacy with him. Now, I've said this already in the sermon, I will probably say it again, I identify with Martha. I think there's some Martha-ness in me. And I can be a busybody, and I can be the one who thinks they're hard done by. You know, our previous church, where I sometimes find myself, end of a service, everyone else has gone, and it's just me there to clear away the chairs, and I've got to sort the rubbish, and I'd be there in a flat doing this, and George would come in, and poor George, I'd sort of pour out my whole rant on George. And he would patiently sort of wait, sort of give him sort of as though he was paying attention. Yeah, absolutely. But what he'd do is sort of wait for me to sort of stop my rant. And he'd probably say my name, Katie, and I'd sort of be still putting a chair away, and I'd be picking up the rubbish, and then he might sort of take whatever was in my hands, and he might just put his hand on my shoulder and just look me in the eyes and say, "Katie." I'm not saying George is like Jesus here, but that's how I imagine this scene happening with Martha. I imagine Jesus saying, "Martha," to get her attention, and then again looking into her eyes with compassion and understanding and love, and in a gentle tone just saying, "Martha." Jesus doesn't rebuke Martha for the work that she was doing. You know, he doesn't devalue that work. What he's doing in this moment, though, is saying what Mary has chosen is better. He is valuing Mary's choice there above the choice that Martha made. And in doing so, what he's saying to Martha is, you can come and sit here too. You are welcome here at my feet. I give you permission to come and sit. I give you permission to come out from under the sense of obligation and the distractions that have been placed on you by society, but also that you've placed on yourself willingly. Come out from under them and come and sit at my feet. And this is the invitation that is for all of us. You know, we've already looked at it in today's service. It's Jesus running out to meet us and embracing us. You know, we talk about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. What was all that for? It was to restore the relationship that we have with the Father. All of this, it's a coming back to what we were made for. This devotion, it's not an optional extra to your life. It's not something I'm just offering here as something you might like to try as a follower of Jesus. But it's what we are made for. It is a non-negotiable. We are made for relationship and connection with God. And our devotion might look different to our friends or our neighbours, to the person sat in the pew next to us. Perhaps some of us in this room encounter God really deeply in moments of sung worship. Others of us less so. Some of us in communion, we really feel connected with God. Others in silence or nature. We all encounter God in different ways. And that's not surprising, is it? We're different. We see Martha and Mary encounter God. If you want to read more, John 11, John 12, we see Martha and Mary encountering God in different ways. You know, we're made differently. It's amazing. The creator of the earth encounters each of us differently. What I want to say is I want you to be open, though, to God encountering you, to having moments of connection with God in something you maybe had written off. Maybe you thought, do you know what? Sung worship, it's really nice for some of you, but not for me. You know, that's not where I meet God. Be open. Like it's Johnny's word at the beginning, right? God might want to meet you there today. But also be content in how God does speak to you. You can think of it like a table. We're all invited to this table to be with Jesus, to spend time with him. When we get to the table, what we order, the food we eat, the flavour it takes might be different for each of us, but the non-negotiable is devotion. It's being at that table with one another and with Jesus. Now, I'm just really briefly, I'm not going to touch on this much because I think we'll run out of time, but I just want to point out in John 11, now we didn't read this passage, but I want to look at what Martha's devotion looked like. Now, in John 11, what we see is Lazarus is ill. Martha's brother is ill. And Martha and Mary, they send a message for Jesus. They figured out some way of doing it that wasn't text or calling ahead. They sent a message for Jesus, and they said, Jesus, come, Lazarus is ill. And Jesus didn't get there in time. When Jesus did arrive, Martha, being the one who could control her emotions more, was the first one to go out and meet him and let him know her disappointment. The moment of encounter was this moment here. There was this exchange that happened, and what Martha did through Jesus' questioning was show a deep trust and a deep faith in Jesus. She didn't sort of have that moment and then run away thinking, oh, Jesus, if only he'd listened to my plan, if only he'd come when I said this would all be sorted. She stuck with him. She trusted him. She just stuck close to him. And she went on to witness, the glory of God, the greatest miracle, her brother being raised from the dead. And I don't know if for some of us here today, devotion might just look like sticking with it, sticking with Jesus in a time when perhaps we feel disappointed, we feel let down by God, sticking with him and trusting, turning up each Sunday, turning up to a moment of connection and prayer with God. I'm just going to read a little section from this book called Domestic Monastery, which, by the way, if you spend most of your time at home, I recommend reading this book because it gives just so much sort of life and so much of a way to view your life at home and how it relates to your sort of growth with God. And this section has really helped me in those moments when encounter with God feels less than spectacular. This sort of analogy has really helped me. It says, imagine you have an aged mother in a nursing home and you've committed to visiting her twice a week. How do you sustain yourself in this? Not by feeling, energy, or emotion, but by commitment, routine, and ritual. You go to visit her at a given time, not because you feel like it, but because it's time. You go to visit her in spite of the fact that sometimes you don't feel like it, that you sometimes can't give her the best of your heart, and that often you are tired, distracted, restless, overburdened, and are occasionally sneaking a glance at your watch and wondering how you can make a graceful exit. Moreover, your conversation with her will not always be about deep or meaningful things. Occasionally, there will be emotional satisfaction and the sense that something important was shared. But many times, perhaps most often, there will only be the sense that it was good that you were there and that an important, life-giving connection has been nurtured and sustained despite what seemingly occurred at the surface. You've been with your mother, and that's more important than whatever feelings or conversation might have taken place on a given day. Prayer works in the same way. That's why the saints and the great spiritual writers have always said that there is only one non-negotiable rule for prayer. Show up regularly. The ups and downs of our minds and hearts are of secondary importance. It's a song we sing, even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. When we come into the presence of God, when we position ourselves for encounter, we will be transformed by his love. Whether we feel it or not, we will be being transformed. Now, finally, our last passage. Let's have a look at the final time we see Martha in the Gospels. It says in John 12, verse 1 to 2, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honour. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table. 2 words, Martha served. Now, have we come full circle? Has this whole thing been a waste of time and she's back exactly where she started? I don't think so. Martha's circumstances, however, have not changed. That we can read. She is still serving. She is still the head of a household. There are still dinner parties to host. There are still meals to cook, dishes to wash. The work that Martha is doing has not changed because there was not a problem with the work that she was doing. The service was never the problem. Think back to that moment where Jesus invited Martha into intimacy. He didn't devalue her work, but what he did was value Mary's above it. What Jesus is saying there is that the order matters. So Martha's circumstances haven't changed. So what has happened to Martha? Well, I think Martha has undergone a radical reordering of her life. Martha is now serving, but she's doing so out of the overflow of an encounter and deep intimacy with Jesus. You know, it's the same for us. Our circumstances are very unlikely to change off the back of a good prayer time. You know, perhaps some of us will be called to have a radical, practical shift in our lives, perhaps become missionaries in a different country. But for me, tomorrow morning when I sit down and pray and I finish praying, I will still have a nappy to change. Our circumstances are unlikely to change. So for us, the shift needs to be this radical reordering of our lives. Like Martha, if we try doing things for God before spending time with him, then like Martha, it is likely that we will burn out, we will get resentful, and we will tire of doing the good things. We need to prioritize spending time in God's presence. When George and I got married, we had engraved on our wedding rings Matthew 6:33, which is the verse that says, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." I need to trust that when Jesus said that, that promise was true. I need to seek first his kingdom. I need to put encounter with him and spending time with him first, and trust that all the other good things that I would potentially strive for, my rest, my peace, you know, my son's future, all these good things that I would strive for, I need to trust that Jesus will add them to me. And this is what we are going after as a church. If you have taken nothing from anything George or I have said over the past 5 or 6 months, then hear this. This is what we're going after. We are going after a radical reordering of our lives as disciples of Jesus. Of course, it will result in overflow. It will result in activism. But it has to start with devotion. That's why we put such an emphasis on prayer and worship. That's why our vision is to fall in love with Jesus and then overflow, not the other way around. That's why Bishop Paul, our Bishop of Nottingham, he has been talking in the past few years about abiding before abounding. And just in case you thought we were doing something new here in Wilford or in Silverdale and Compton Acres or in Nottingham itself, St. Ignatius, many years before, talked about contemplative activism. He talked about the fact that we have to be with God and then carry his heart into the world. So this isn't radical because it's not been done before. It has been done before. It's radical because our culture today wants the kingdom without the king. We want the good life without God. We want things right now. You know, we want at the click of our fingers to have the most transformed prayer life. We want good things, but we don't want to put in the time. You know, we want to overflow without necessarily having to do all that falling in love thing. We want to abound with the life that Jesus promises without first having to abide. And we want the activism without the sort of daily grind of the contemplation. And so that's my invitation to us today. Will we come back to the feet of Jesus? Will we allow him to reorder our lives? And will we sit a little longer in his presence? When I come to prayer and all those thoughts and emotions rise up in me, I've come to realise they're not mine to process and figure out and work out exactly what's going on. What I do is I ask the Holy Spirit to come. And I believe, like in Genesis chapter 1, where it says the Spirit hovered over the waters or over the chaos, I believe that as I come and sit before him, he hovers over the chaos of my life and says, let there be.